Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth in our Playbook Masterclass series this fall. I am delighted to welcome this afternoon Tom Switzer and Priyanka Agarwal. Unfortunately, Victor Chan was called away at the last minute, but I'm delighted to share that Tom is going to jump in and cover his material. So we will still have a terrific presentation and a really rich discussion with all of you. Tom, Priyanka, before I hand over to you both, let me just walk folks who haven't yet attended a masterclass series through a little bit of housekeeping so they know how to participate. So quick note for everyone, full disclosure, we are recording this afternoon's session. And in fact, slides and the recording will be posted both to the DIME website and to the Playbook website later today. Priyanka and Tom will be running through a couple of slides and a couple of key points from the playbook, specifically as they relate to clinical trials as we kick off. And then we'll spend most of our time today in discussion. So to really allow you guys to get involved, there are a couple of ways that you can participate. So first of all, if you are somewhere where you can talk, you can raise your hand in the participant list. I will be monitoring that. I'll call on you and you can ask your question live to Tom, to Priyanka, and really participate in the conversation. If it's easier for you, you can type your question into the chat box or into the Q&A function. Again, I'll be monitoring those and I'll get as many of those questions over to Priyanka and over to Tom as I can. And with that, thanks again, everyone, for being here. Tom and Priyanka, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourselves, go through your slides, and you just tell me as you need to advance.
Okay, just a really quick introduction. Again, Tom Switzer. I work at Genentech. I work in the digital transformation office in our research and early development organization. Actually, in the informatics componentry, where I'm looking across kind of broad portfolio usage of technology in both almost biomarker discovery or digital biomarker discovery, as well as implementation within our clinical trials and early development space. But we have a lot of work going on at Genentech and Roche, and I kind of represent the early development engine there. Background, I'm a physiologist by training, and then I spent a lot of years in ClinOps, so I kind of at it from a scientist level, from a operations and implementation level, and then over the last several years, been working on the technology component and how to put this all together in a research setting.
Good morning, and thanks so much, everyone, for joining. It's been really exciting to see all the interest with digital health and digital measures. So I'm a physician at MyoKardia, and I'll share more about MyoKardia when we get to my portion. But I'm also a physician by training and spent many years on faculty at UCSF, where I still practice, really thinking about technology adoption from the patient perspective with regards to telehealth and overall clinical care. And so I'm really happy to be here this morning.
Fantastic, thanks both. And what I should have mentioned and what I'll underscore is Priyanka and Tom were co-creators of the playbook. It was an absolute pleasure to work alongside them and their Genentech and MyoKardia teams in our collaboration here. And Tom, you get the gold medal of the day. You win Zoom bingo for the first interruption. I'm sure it won't be the last. We are all working at home to stay safe, and that gave me a good giggle. So with that, Tom, I'll hand over to you. I know that you're going to present a few slides to lead off, and then Priyanka will come to you.
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. Sorry about that. So, I mean, we're going to build off the playbook, really looking at sort of the measures, which is really where we should start, as well as the technologies and then the operations. I know our the playbook does cover some elements of like where you should start, and oftentimes people kind of get a little start on the technology side and then try to figure out where it fits, which is almost like a solution looking for a problem. So again, with regards to the measures, we always want to look at the meaningful aspect of health, really specifically around the patient, like what's important to the patient. And sometimes by extension, what's important for us as sponsors about things we want to prevent happening to the patient. Then looking at the concept of interest, kind of a large layer, like what actually looking at in terms of measurement capabilities, and then define the outcome or endpoint and be a little bit more specific from there. From there, we kind of move into the technology, like what's fit for purpose in terms of measuring the physiologic signal that we're looking at, and then evaluating its sort of maturity, how it's going to be used, will it actually work appropriately, and such in the planning, and then moving into the operations. And Priyanka will talk a little about the operations. I'll cover a little bit of the first two elements. We can move on. So with regards to a little bit more detail about the meaningful aspect of health, aspect of a disease that a patient doesn't want to become worse. I mean, again, and I'll get some specific examples in a sec, or want to improve or want to prevent. And as I said, by extension, sometimes in early safety use cases, we also want to prevent certain adverse events or early detection of adverse events, which fits into this, because certainly the patient doesn't want to have that happen as well. The concept of interest, which is more around the simplified or narrowed element that can actually be measured. It's like meaningful aspect of health is what do you want to measure? Concept of interest is it measurable? Or do we have to look for proxies? And then basically trying to articulate that as a clinical measurement as an outcome more specifically. And then an endpoint, which basically adds in a statistical component looking at degrees of change as predefined with regards to that outcome. Next slide. So in terms of ones that we put into the playbook, the meaningful aspect of health, we kind of centered around Parkinson's disease and an anxiety disorder. But Parkinson's, it can be something as simple as like, from a patient's perspective, I want to be able to walk so I can carry my own groceries. I've done some work in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. One of the ones I see is like, a patient with IPF who can't move, can we improve them enough so they can get out and do something important, which I think is really an important construct for this. The concept of interest from there really is activity. And in this case, walking capacity and activity can be very broad. It can be very fine, like gait, specific things, or functional activity and movement and such, and you need to define that. And then moving on for the outcome, looking at the, hold on a second. So the walking bouts per day, which is fairly gross, looking at just again, how people sort of move around and function within their day. And that can be articulated further as an endpoint, which is looking at a % change from baseline in Parkinson's. Alternatively, like an anxiety, again, folks who are having trouble sleeping or resting. Again, we can look at sleep. There's a number of tools in the market, from actigraphy, wrist-worn actigraphy, to bedside devices, to sleep mats, to all sorts of things looking at sleep. It's become very important because, to quote Adam Amder from the CTTI work, we spend, a third of our time sleeping. We often don't look at it that closely, but it has a profound impact on our quality of life. And so outcome measures could be things like time to sleep onset or awake after sleep onset, or some standard measures from sleep medicine. And then we want to look at these in terms of, like, say, average change from time to sleep onset, or number of nighttime awakenings, or duration of nighttime awakenings, or things like that, that actually could have an impact. And I think even beyond that, sometimes to assess the impact of those, of that sleep structure on daily function, like sleepiness, mental alertness, brain fog, some of these other sort of things that maybe we want to look to subjectively characterize.
Yeah, one point to just add to what Tom shared is that when you're looking at the clinical measure, one thing that I'd really recommend based on our work at Myocardia is really thinking about how established the clinical measure is. And so, some of these digital health clinical measures are very accepted. For example, if you're looking at heart rate is the same regardless of how you measure it. Others of these measures, for example, walking bouts per day, you can certainly say that somebody's walking more bouts a day, but you have to contextualize that to a specific disease process and to a specific group of patients. And once you're having to do that, that's a much larger ask. And that's an area where I think this type of ecosystem can really have an impact if groups of us are working on things like looking at walking bouts per day and working to contextualize that both clinically and from a regulatory perspective.
Thank you. We can move on a little bit. One of the things, again, looking at the meaningful aspects of health really is looking at patient engagement. And this is a bit sort of iterative. Oftentimes, you kind of have to ask good questions to make sure you're honing in on what are the key questions to answer. Again, going from general feeling to something more specific, and then trying to characterize, like, I just want to feel better versus, well, how do you want to feel better? I want to be able to get up and move. I want to enjoy the activities of life. And how do we sort of map some of these measures into that? And then really looking at this continuous process. It's almost, again, like product design methodology, where you start off with a prototype and you sort of test it, and then you iterate on it and test it and iterate on it. And you go back and forth until basically you feel like you have something that's important. I think it's actually one of those really important things that, patients in the clinical trial space, they're sick. And we want to be really mindful about how much we give them and what we take from them in this regard. And so we need to be really, really thoughtful in what we ask them to do, because otherwise it's not a great place to do some of that. Oh, lost a screen there. There we go. So again, and the idea of going back, and this can sometimes be code development, especially if you're looking at developing endpoints or novel endpoints that can help larger populations feel, function, or survive. The next slide. So again, just more, just to sort of reemphasize the patient engagement stuff. I think there's also some resources like the patient-focused drug development. I know the voice of the patient was an interesting one. Again, going back to the IPF work that we've done, I know, and that one is interesting because patients' chief complaint is cough. And yet in IPF space, there's not much for cough monitoring, although there's a lot of technology that's being developed to measure cough. So hopefully we'll see that as an endpoint that is important to the patient. But potentially may actually have some measure of effectiveness of therapies as well. But again, there's a number of elements to really solicit patient input, but engage early and often. Also the same recommendation for regulators, engage early and often. I think it's this collective movement to sort of bring these technologies to fruition. All right, keep moving. So as we talked about, there's a variety of endpoints. I know on the DIME Society page, we've got, I think, there are 400 on the public list there of types of endpoints that are being used. And again, you can go very broad to very specific. And again, I think there's even more, but they're not ready to be made public just yet, that we're looking at in development. But as far as a clinical measure, the outcome is something that we can measure. But then you have to basically winnow it down to an endpoint. And that actually gets to be a little bit of art there about percentage, percent change, or time spent at certain intensity levels, or looking at these, both the physiologic measures like steps or movement or something like that, but also like these percent change from baseline or percent change from day over day or total time. And sometimes, breaking these, I think in breast cancer, I think there was a paper published that showed, differences in response with patients who had more than 6 steps per day, 6,000 steps per day, or less than 6,000 steps per day. So again, is this predictive or is this sort of reflective of where they started? But really looking at that with some sort of pre-specification as to what the changes are you're going to be looking at. And so again, you want to kind of select these and develop these endpoints that are precise enough to determine our intervention is beneficial to the patient. And this is in some respects sort of the clinical validation and the clinical context of how it's actually going to be used, but it's meaningful for the patients that you're testing this under. We can move along again. Here's some just reference to some other tools, as I mentioned, the CTTI work, which we worked on previously, but also the Corey and the voice of the patient reports from the initiative. I know there were a number of indications when they went through these interviews a few years ago. And I think there's also, there's also a number of patient groups that can be engaged with depending on your organization and how it actually works. But again, just reemphasizing patient engagement, you've got to select the endpoint that actually matters to them as people and relates to their disease. And then for us as sponsors, that becomes measurable and that we can sort of characterize effectively. All right, keep moving along. All right.
Just make, if Tom doesn't mind me jumping in, this idea of there being 400 endpoints and just so many endpoints, I think that's something for us as an ecosystem to also think about in terms of, are there certain endpoints that we want to elevate? Of course, if you look at, for example, an echocardiogram, there's tons of endpoints in an echo and nobody's saying that one part of an echo is more important than another. But at the same time, we can all agree that there are certain parts of the echo that we look at more frequently than others. And so I'd love to see us think about that as a community as well. So if you're looking at activity, are there certain things that you always look at and they're more minute pieces that you look at for specific patient populations, I think that would be a great area for this ecosystem to think about and coalesce around.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, like one of the endpoints that I've liked in this discussions, I think with Actor, the idea of like, and I think we presented like the pulmonary arterial hypertension, the MVPA endpoint. For me, in like population health, it's fascinating. I've seen it applications of which is just looking at people moving from different types of intensities and trying to characterize. But I mean, that's one example of an endpoint that seems to be resonating with my own organization. But certainly we have some specific like gait discrepancies and other ones which are precise, but they may not be helpful for an asthma patient or a COPD patient or something like that. So again, kind of matching it to the patient population. But I do think, I agree with Priyanka. I mean, again, the idea that we should be settling on some of these in some larger constructs how we set it up. All right, so as we mentioned with the technologies, again, we've kind of decided what we want to measure, and now we have to figure out how do we want to measure it. And I always looking at the technologies, there's a couple of constructs there. One of it's like on a body, you only have so much real estate, borrowing from Andy Corvos's comment with one of the meetings, there's only so much real estate you can append these things to. And we have to look at, in some cases, like what's the form factor? Is it wrist worn? What limitations for wrist worn versus, say, a patch versus, say, some of these other sort of things. And then also looking at the risk benefit and the maturity of the technology, that utility and usability is, what's the right site for these things? Can you collect, gait data from wrist worn activities? So can be a little bit more challenging. Security and data rights, and this is honestly, personally, is one of my blind spots, because I kind of go into this as a scientist, not as an engineer. And so I need to be really mindful about looking at the security and data rights aspect of it, or I at least have somebody in my organization who knows more about this and understands the security risks, because it's, as a researcher looking at these as tool and the optimist, I sometimes kind of overlook some of this there, and there be dragons in some of this. So we can keep moving on. So just in terms of, digging a little bit deeper, we want to measure, we determine what we want to measure. Now it's looking at the technologies. One of it's around specification requirements. If you're looking at movement, you're likely looking at actigraphy, either an accelerometer or an inertial measurement unit or something like that. And then it goes into what's the form factor. The benefits and risk, which is a little bit different. Largely the benefits, again, looking at precision, getting a signal more frequently that actually can give us deeper insight or a faster time to signal, like a drug effect. The risks, I mean, again, largely the technology itself sometimes doesn't have much of risk in application. You might get skin irritation with a patch or something, but the risks really become more around like data privacy and security. Can it be hacked? I know I even heard in some of the medical devices, like, pacemakers that connect to the internet, can these be hacked and something happen with that, which is actually really frightening. And then looking at the safety and the efficacy of the technology itself and how it actually works. And also, I mean, one of the things like when you design and write your protocols, if you do have a device-related adverse event, like what's your reporting mechanism? Not only do you have to report on the safety and events for the drug, but you do have to have a mechanism for if there's something weird that happens with the technology. And sometimes we don't think about that when we plan. We can move on. So this one, we kind of break this down into a lot of steps within the playbook, and I actually found this really helpful. I mean, one of them is the verification, analytical validation, clinical validation, the V3 construct. And I know, Jen, this is your paper you guys published earlier this year, but we're finding it really foundational, at least to identify that there are sort of 3 distinct elements that you need to meet with this. That, does the hardware perform as intended? Do we look at some of these as a physiologic construct? Like measuring sleep, someone asleep or awake, but then the clinical validation is that relevance and are there disease-specific characterizations there. With regards to security, safety by design or quality management system, are they ISO 13485 compliant, which is actually important for us. And sometimes consumer hardware, when we want to look at that, we have to dig a little bit deeper versus regulated hardware. Is there like a disclosure policy? Like a software vulnerability disclosure policy, like if you have white hat hackers. I know there's a slide in the playbook about people who try to test these vulnerabilities and then report them out so that these manufacturers can improve their product because to prevent from malicious interventions. And the other one I think is the software bill of materials, which is just basically like listing all of the components that go into the software. Moving over to the right, data rights and governance, who has access to the data. I mean, most of us probably have consumer devices, but have you ever read like the end user license agreement or the terms of service? You know, I've got a number of widgets and I'm fascinated with how they work, but sometimes I just overlook that element. Is the privacy policy publicly accessible? You know, what are these sort of elements here? And this is what I meant, you know, about trying to be global and how you look at this. Utility and usability. This goes into both selections I mentioned, like where should it be worn? Where can you collect it? Do you want somebody to wear a patch for 6 weeks continuously? What kind of irritation you get versus a watch? Is it a chunky watch that looks like you've got a old calculator on your wrist, or does people want to wear the new Apple Series 6 iWatch type thing? Because that actually will impact in sort of wearability and usability. Battery life, you do have to charge these things. And can you acknowledge that sometimes when you take it off for charging, can you lose data? Is there technical support available if these things don't connect? Playing with a Whoop, just because I find it a little fascinating, goofy technology as a bike racer, and it was like, oh, I can't get this bloody thing to pair. It took me an hour to figure out how to pair it with my phone. So where's the tech support for this? And I think this goes into when we design our trials, what do we want patients to do? If it isn't connecting, who do they call? And they should have like one person to call, and that person should know if they go to tier 1 or tier 2 technical support. But we need to make it painless for patients to use and also painless for the sites to use if we really expect to get really high quality data out of this. And this is not an insignificant aspect of setting it up. Economic feasibility, what's kind of the cost, the benefit versus price. There's an interesting discussion we've had, you know, like when you look at some large global phase 3 studies, you know, in ePro space, where we paid for 3,500 HTC mobile phones that were obsolete at the end of the trial. What do you do with 3,500 HTC mobile phones at the end of the trial? Do you have a purchase model, or do you have a lease model where you have to give it back and somebody else can figure it out? I mean, this happens not just with digital technology. I think it amplifies it, but sometimes we provide laptops to sites, and those laptops are, you know, can we donate those to schools? So I think the idea of like the economic feasibility doesn't make sense to deploy at scale. And then what do you do with the technology when it's done, and what do you get out of it in terms of value? You know, the return on your investment versus the cost in terms of spend. Some of these technologies aren't particularly cheap, you know, 500 per implementation per device, and you want to run it in a 2,500 patient study. It's like, it's not an insignificant outlay of cash, but I think you just kind of evaluate, like, what are you going to get for your spend and your investment in these sort of things. All right, we can keep going. So task specific to clinical research. I mean, again, you know, there's a little bit between COA versus biomarker, and COA is always the feels, function, survive. And if it's not that, then it's typically a biomarker, which is more around the physiologic measurements. As we mentioned, select and position endpoints. I mean, in some cases, you have well-established primary endpoints for approval of drug, and these digital health tools will provide knowledge, but they will never be a primary endpoint, but they may actually help in differentiating in a label claim or something like that. And you probably want to get some understanding of that through engagement with regulators up front, or even if you're about to embark on a biomarker development program, like how would you actually intend to use what you get on this? Again, some indications have really well-established endpoints. So to be mindful of that. Technology, regulatory status, I think some people kind of dive a little bit into the regulatory status, like, you know, is it a 510K cleared, or is it CE marked, which is important, but it's not a selector element of it. I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. Looking at the end user license agreements and the terms of use statements, depending on your setup, you know, negotiate contract with the tech vendors, and in some cases from clinical trials, we may engage directly with the manufacturer and they'll provide the hardware, and then we may actually have intermediate like service providers or CROs that actually will do this or will help deploy and provision devices and manage the tech support. But there can be, you know, multiple contracts, and depending on your organization and their sort of procurement process, what that actually looks like. And then looking at the, you know, the 21 Part 11 compliance for sort of attribution and such. But also I think what we sometimes see is on the security elements, as we talked about, a lot about hacking and penetration testing and systems validation and things like that, that actually also need to be included in your assessment and even your onboarding. Quality by design, which is, again, you know, plans for quality, you know, through documentation and good documentation practices, and detailing how you're going to plan to do. We do decide a little bit on real-time data sharing, and this varies. This goes back to talking to the patients. I know sometimes in spirometry measures that some patients don't want to see their spirometry measures because it shows them getting worse, and others do. And do you have a way of actually doing real-time sharing? Or if this is really looking at interoperability of a home wearable versus an in-clinic assessment where you're doing sort of an after-the-fact analysis and you're not doing any alarming, then you probably don't need real-time sharing. But sometimes real-time sharing can be I mean, you need to be mindful on actually how you plan that. Train trial staff on it. I think because we're technologists by nature, we assume that everybody is pretty easy to adopt this technology, but there's probably a fair amount of Luddites out there that we have to kind of work through this and get people comfortable with it, that it's going to work, and make people feel confident it's going to work as intended. Informed consent, you do need to add elements. What you're intending to use the data. I think one of the other elements is like what we give back to patients, which I think is just general. Sometimes it's been lacking in clinical trials overall. Like they give blood and tissue, and we don't even tell them what the studies are. But I think with digital data, people are becoming much more conditioned to actually getting their data back or seeing their data in more real time. And I think again, it's something that's the expectation, and we kind of need to design around that fact. Looking at your management plan, again, this is device provisioning. What do you do at the end of the study? Do you need to recalibrate some of these tools? They're calibrated before they go out, and you need to bring back a subset and then have them recalibrated to see if there's been any signal drift so that you can still say that your signal is accurate. Study monitoring, still something you have to look at. Again, you can't go into the raw data, but you should actually be able to do data traceability, and this fits into the monitoring plan. Safety monitoring as well, depending on the intended use of what we're looking at and if there's any adverse events. Obviously, the last one, if we're submitting it, we're looking for inspections and the marketing applications and understanding the intended use of the data and what it's actually going to look like. So I think then, Priyanka, I think you'll cover more of this, the operations. I went through probably a little more detail than I should have here. We'll cover. So we can keep moving. Just touching on the one about regulatory approval of technology. Again, it doesn't indicate fit for purpose whether it's got a 510K clearance. I mean, there are no devices that are approved for clinical trials. 510K means it has an intended use. And largely, I think some cases we like a 510K because it indicates there's a QMS system. But really, from my own perspective, what I like to look at, just because we evaluate a lot of technologies, is looking at, is there a QMS system? Are they ISO compliant? That for me actually says that they've actually put some mindfulness into the quality by design framework, and that there's adequate design controls and some documentations, which I think becomes really important for the verification component. Same with the CE mark. But again, these shouldn't be barriers for the use or non-use of the technology. I mean, we do look at consumer tools as well. It just basically means you have a lot more work to do in sort of establishing the rationale for the use and what sort of methodology you went through to select the technology and why you chose to use the hardware you chose to use. So we can keep going on. So I think this is just what I just re-emphasizing what I just said. You don't need to use a cleared product. It does help, but it's not necessary. And again, some of these, some of these consumer devices are interesting, but I think you have to go back and do your homework for it. And I actually, this is an interesting aside with my own views. I am interested in some of the consumer technology, not so much in its clinical accuracy, but in actually how they return data to patients and how it actually impacts behavior things. And there's things like, the Aura Ring readiness score and the Whoop score and all these sleep scores and all these sort of things, but I think actually really important. And these aren't regulated devices. These are consumer tools, but you can learn from them. And maybe, again, we have to basically adopt them under a more rigorous framework so that we can use them to make claims off of it. But I think it's the idea of being sort of open in how we look at it. There's some other resources on the other side of the slide here. About guidance, and I know in the regulatory space, they're kind of to adapt as much as we are to various pharma collaborations like pharma and bio and others and stuff, and really to get what this is actually going to look like. So I think we're all kind of on this large ship trying to steer it and build it a bit at the same time in some respects, but I think we're a lot more clear about what we need now than we were even like 5 years ago. And the last one for me. So again, just to mention about Europe. In Europe, there's sometimes a little bit differences in how they view algorithms and technology as well. But again, you don't need to use a CE mark. if it's being used as a research tool, and we're not intended to commercialize it with any medical claim. But basically, if you are looking at commercializing, maybe you have to look at it differently. And then again, this is engaging with your regulatory groups as well as the EMA as appropriate. So, and with that, feels like I was just sprint speaking there. I hope I spoke slowly enough and people could understand me. I like to talk about this stuff, but I might go a little overboard at times. But if not, I'll hand it over to Priyanka.
Thanks so much, Tom. So I'm going to dive in and offer some experience from MyoKardia using activity as an endpoint in several of our trials. So just to give you all some background, MyoKardia is a small pharmaceutical company focused on cardiovascular disease and developing precision therapeutics. And our first area has been, a focus has been on the disease hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is the most commonly inherited cardiomyopathy. It has an autosomal dominant inheritance. So you talk to these families and it's devastating hearing parents talk about how sad it was for them to pass this illness on to their children. And the way that the disease manifests is that it can be a chronic illness where you have fatigue, shortness of breath, difficulty doing parts of your everyday life, or it can unfortunately oftentimes manifest where the first sign of disease is sudden cardiac death. So there's a range of outcomes, and the disease can be quite devastating both to individuals and to their families. And so MyoKardia is developing the first ever drug for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy called mavacamten. And this drug acts by reducing the hypercontractility of the heart to relieve the obstruction that's present that blocks blood from being passed from the heart to the rest of the body. And so our sense in developing this drug is that it should absolutely have an impact on quality of life, on the way that patients function. And so one of our primary endpoints was looking at exercise capacity, but we also wanted to understand, well, beyond exercise capacity measured in a lab, is this actually having an impact on the way that patients move day to day? And what's been really gratifying for us is that when we meet with patients who've been in our trials, we hear that, gosh, it can be so hard understanding these technical details that come out of trials. It's really great to understand, well, how is this drug really impacting me? And of course, we hear from patients that I'm feeling so much better, but it's nice to see that quantified in a way that patients can understand as well. And where MyoKardia is at with this drug is that we were very excited to have really amazing phase 3 pivotal trial data earlier this year. And our hope is that this drug will be available for patients in the near future. And so I'm going to walk you through now a little bit of how we thought to measure activity and think about activity in this patient population. So we could go to the next slide. So again, we started from this concept of we really want to understand what patients' activity levels are like, what's their walking ability. And so when you actually drill down to, well, what is the outcome? There's a number of different ways of measuring outcomes that I think Tom has already touched upon to a certain degree. But one thing that I'll mention is that, of course, we are all so in the know at this point of thinking about activity, about measuring our own activity. I think so many of us have one of these types of devices and we get our step count from them, which is a really nice way of thinking about our activity. What's challenging with step count, though, is that step count is actually derived from an algorithm that's based on how much your hand is actually moving in space. And those algorithms are typically developed for pretty standard adult men and women. And so you could imagine that an algorithm that's developed for a 30 or 40-year-old white man may not accurately capture activity in an older patient with heart disease. And so as we were thinking about these outcome measures, we thought, well, we do want to think about step count because step count is so ubiquitous. It's something that people understand, but we also do need to think about the data before it's been processed, especially since we're unfortunately not at the point where these algorithms are specific for men, for women, for different racial groups, for different disease processes. My hope is that we will get there, but we're just not there at this time. And so when you do look at that pre-processed data, you are left with accelerometer units. gosh, those are even harder to understand than step count. You're left with these measures that are like, this patient had 2 million average daily accelerometer units. And that's even harder to understand than a step count. And beyond that, another challenge that we found that I may have alluded to during Tom's portion is that, we don't actually know how to think about what normal activity is for healthy people, let alone for specific disease processes. And so this is, again, an area where I think that this community and ecosystem can have an impact, whereby, I'd love to see everybody that's working in this area publish their data in peer-reviewed journals so that we can start to build a library of research around, well, there may not be a lot of research in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or on activity levels, but at least I can draw on data from diastolic heart failure or systolic heart failure. And if we can have a sense of how activity levels are tied to clinical outcomes, because that's really how we're going to build the evidence base here. Not just that activity levels go up or down, but that as activity levels change, we're finding that clinical outcomes are changing hand in hand. So that, to me, is going to be very fundamental to this field moving forward. And that's going to be a multi-year process. It's not going to be something that happens overnight. But I think all of us that are collecting data, thinking about these hard questions, are really adding to this field. And my sense is that where we are with PROs today, that was probably a 10-year process. We're embarking on that journey with these digital measures, and it's going to have to happen for each clinical measure that's in an area that's relatively novel, i.e. it's not something accepted like heart rate. So if we move on, we can then think about, how we actually move through going from a concept to design to then having your trial run and ultimately having it be ready for regulatory submission. What I do want to underscore, though, is that so many of us here are experts at operationalizing work in a clinical trial concept. It is tricky, but I think that there's a lot of expertise that's out there. What I really want to underscore today for everybody who's here is the why is incredibly important and the goals are incredibly important because, again, this is a long journey. We can't necessarily draw on past evidence the way that we can for other standard clinical measures. So having a really tight case for why you're doing this measure is incredibly important and will ultimately help generate interest in the work that you're doing. So for us at MyoKardia in cardiovascular disease, I think it makes absolute sense that, we want to know that not only are these drugs affecting clinical outcomes, that they are improving quality of life from a PRO perspective, we'd love to see that people are actually more active. And that's something that we hear from patients and families all the time. When we ask them, how are you feeling? The number one thing that we hear from patients is that, well, my wife, before, she would just refuse to walk up X, Y, or Z hill near her house, or she could never walk more than a block without stopping to be short of breath. And the number one thing that we hear now is that my partner is moving better or my family member is moving better. And so what we'd love to do with this body of work is to take those anecdotes and be able to quantify them. And I think another area that I'm very interested in is this idea of what is normal. We can think of what's normal for and this is actually a very complicated question. There's what's normal for a healthy person, what's normal for a man versus a woman, what's normal for a specific demographic group. But then you can get down to, well, what's normal for a specific disease process? How much do particular patients move? But then you can actually get down to, well, what's normal for this person? And that's actually an area where I think this data can be incredibly meaningful because we are collecting continuous data. And so we may not have all the answers around, well, what's normal in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but we can have a sense of what's normal for this person. And that's a space where I think this data could leapfrog the kind of normal process of developing clinical measures, because that's really the power here. If you think about the way that an Apple Watch works in determining your heart rhythm, a lot of it is benchmarking to what your baseline heart rhythm is. And so in my mind, that could be an area where this work is quite powerful, where, you know, it may take on the order of years for us to answer these questions around benchmarking and the type of endpoint that we want to use. But an area where you could leapfrog is where you end up essentially benchmarking many of these measures to particular individuals, and then get a sense of how individuals are changing and what that means for an individual's health. So if an individual's activity goes up 20%, what do we see that goes on alongside with their clinical markers? Do we see that now their echo parameters are looking different, their heart rate parameters, and so forth? And so that's where I think these clinical trial contexts can be incredibly helpful beyond clinical practice, because of course in a clinical trial context we are thinking and measuring all of these parameters, and so you end up with these very robust data sets and can start to get to some of those questions. And so that's kind of my personal feeling in this space, and it's not necessarily on the slides, but you know, I think that's where this work can be quite powerful. And so I will run through some of these operational issues. I think Tom has hit on a lot of them, and I am mindful that we only have about 15 minutes left. So maybe Jen, I think Tom did cover a lot of these pieces, so we could wrap up the formal portion and then just end for a Q&A.
I love it. Let's do it. And I'm excited. So first of all, actually, what I should say is terrific presentation, Tom, Priyanka, Tom as well. You were very patient as I was desperately trying to stop my computer from restarting. So thank you. And you also dove in and covered Victor's portion really nicely. And for folks on the line, it should be no surprise as to why the quality of the content in the playbook is so good, with input from Tom, with Priyanka, from input with Priyanka. It's really been sort of a pleasure in putting this all together. I see we already have a question, so let me, Cheryl, if you would like to unmute yourself, you can ask your question directly to Tom and to Priyanka.
Hi, Jen. Thank you so much to both of you for your presentations, short presentations. I wanted to sort of tie into things that both of you said. I raised my hand quite early on when Tom was speaking, when you were talking about the meaningful, MAH, meaningful something of health. What was the A stand for?
Aspects.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll get it. And you know, interesting, you gave an example in Parkinson's disease, which an area is very familiar to me, at least. And you know, the outcome may be walking bouts per day, and the endpoint, you know, is percent of patients with, you know, 15% increase of activity from baseline or something of that nature. So my first question I wanted to have a better understanding of how you tied, or how the process that you went through to tie the patient's, you know, aspect of health. I want to be able to carry my own groceries or walk in the grocery store, right? To an increase of 15% activity. Like, how did you make that leap, or was that just a suggestion here? And then also, I guess, tie it into what Priyanka was saying. So I really appreciated the fact that there's a difference from patient-reported outcomes here, right? Obviously, there's similarities in the processes we need to follow in a rigorous manner and set endpoints and objectives before collecting data. We all know how to do clinical trials. On the other hand, the power behind these mobile devices and objective measures is in the, you know, the big data that comes out of it, right? And the ability to see things in that data that we may not have been able to hypothesize from, you know, pre-collection. And that may be very specific to a certain person, right? Or some other understanding from the data that's beyond steps, right? And so it seems like we're still really learning what, you know, from these types of outcomes, what are the appropriate endpoints? And I have concern about sort of making those very strict from the outset, sort of like difficulty making the connection between ensuring we rigorously plan ahead, but leave room for additional learning through these new technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you touched on a number of different points. I think just to answer your first question, your last question first, I think, if you think about activity, once you collect activity, you can run tons of analysis on the data that you collect. So even if your pre-specified endpoint is pretty narrowly defined, whether it's step count or minutes active per day or whatever it may be, you do still have the opportunity to look at the breadth of data that's been collected, to think beyond what the rigid clinical trial measures were. And I think that's in some ways the power of this data, is that this data is incredibly rich. There's tons of analyses that can be done. And so even if your pre-specified endpoint is fairly narrowly defined, I think there is still opportunity thinking about exploratory endpoints for including a ton of additional information. But I think, of course, there is a challenge because an exploratory endpoint is never going to end up on a label or for a disease indication. But I think that, in these early days when we are still learning so much, I think it's nice that even if we are more narrow in what our goals are, we do have the opportunity to learn still a huge amount more. I think another point that I will mention is, you talked about the big data aspect of this, and I think that's an area where we have to be careful because, on the one hand, it is appealing to say that, gosh, it's pretty easy to wear a watch and to charge it. We should just get as much data as we can possibly collect. I think practically that becomes hard from the compliance standards that we set for ourselves in clinical trials. Once you ask a person to wear a device for longer and longer periods of time, there is going to be some fall off in your compliance. And so that ends up being the trade-off that you make. And so I think in a clinical trial context, you have to be careful about that, because if you ask for too much, you may not get what you want from a compliance standpoint. On the other hand, I think in a real world setting, you do have that flexibility where you don't necessarily need the same compliance, and so you can definitely experiment with getting more data. Now, compliance aside, I will say that I personally am not convinced that more data is going to tell us more, and so I do think there's a role for being more targeted in our approach. And in potentially collecting better quality data, because I don't think we know enough about the data yet to say that collecting far more of it is going to increase our insights. I personally haven't seen that yet. I don't know if others on the call feel differently, but I feel like in a sense there may be a role for being more targeted, both to increase the quality of the data, to improve our compliance, and for us to be more specific in our thinking, because I worry that just collecting more data is not necessarily going to increase our insights.
I want to add a little bit to Priyanka's comments. One of the last things you made, and this is more of the future and even related to the Parkinson's patient, but the idea of patients serving as their own control. And I really, where we have enough time to see what's normal for that patient, and then overlaying one of the elements of technology of contextualizing what's going on with that patient. And this could be like, a watch saying it looks like you're moving. I mean, we see this in the consumer space, like Apple Watch little buzz. Are you going for a walk? And we're kind of already do this, but we haven't been able to really contextualize it in sort of the clinical space. But I think that may be one of the areas where we can get at what matters for that patient. And I know, like in the activity space, there's always a bias that more is better, that people go from inactive to active and they're moving around. But I know, like in the RA space, like some of the anti-TNFs have these profound impacts on people's joint function. And they went from being able to a lot of fidgety movement because they're in pain to being able to sit and play the piano or paint or do something like that. And I think that's one of those things that we can really get down to an individual level with the use of these technologies and applied in the right thing. We can get really, really deep insights into what happens for that patient at that time to make real meaningful change in their life. I don't think we're there. That's really aspirational, but we are seeing a little bit of that, like an idea of like these readiness scores and these sort of things and these multi-component endpoints. And I think that's going to get us to the real value of some digital health tools.
Thank you so much, both of you, for that input. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Cheryl, and great questions. I'm going to share some other questions that have come up in the chat. So from Catherine Jin. So hi, Tom and Priyanka. Thanks so much for a great presentation. How far do you think we are from eventually using clinical trial evidence, using these novel measures to actually support the approval of drugs and or reimbursement and make claims on the drug label? Has it been done already?
So there are, if you look on clinicaltrials.gov, there are studies that are underway right now where the primary or secondary endpoints are digital health in nature. So I don't think we're that far away from these endpoints being used for drug approval or label indication purposes, which is really exciting. I think the way that these measures can be used, I think it depends again what your goal is. If you're really hoping to have a drug indication based on these endpoints, I would say use an endpoint where there is more body of evidence present, or in which the benchmarks are more accepted. And so I think, again, you can be creative with this work. So an example would be, there's a lot of technologies now that are leveraging continuous ECG monitoring. And of course, interpretation of an ECG is very accepted. There are still questions around, if you look at AFib, how important AFib burden is. But I think as an example, that work is much further along than, say, activity. Another example could be, well, you can look at total activity, you can look at minutes active per day, but you could also look at measures where there's a fair amount of clinical acceptance, for example, 6-minute walk. There's a lot of evidence and acceptance around the 6-minute walk test in various cardiovascular conditions. So one approach could be thinking about more targeted activity use cases such as 6-minute walk. So I think that there's a range of options that are out there. This work in some areas is moving forward more quickly than others. So I think that there's definitely areas and niches where things are much further along than others.
And Priyanka, that was a terrific answer. And Catherine, just to add some extra resources, Priyanka correctly mentions clinicaltrials.gov as a great resource. We also maintain our crowdsourced library of digital endpoints that Tom referenced earlier on the DIME website. And there we break down all of the digital endpoints that we are aware that are being used in industry-sponsored studies of new medical products. So we see that these measures are being used from across all phases. So from phase 1 all the way through to 4, about 50% of them are being used as primary and secondary endpoints. And we've also just started to catalog and display the type of medical product that's being investigated, whether that's a biologic, a drug, or a device. So I'm very much inclined to agree with Priyanka that we are probably on the cusp of seeing these things coming through on the regulatory side. And every time we talk to our regulatory colleagues, they are very encouraging. They tell us repeatedly that they are open to these measures. So again, I think that's an important bellwether. And great question. Thank you, Catherine. There's another question here, guys, from Chris Willis. Are there any statistics on adoption and compliance rates of different remote monitoring technologies? For example, a tablet versus a phone or a laptop? And how about considerations around bring your own technology rather than provisioned?
I will take a shot. I haven't seen the large scale statistics. I mean, I do see kind of an adherence after about 6 months, people get tired of wearing this stuff unless it becomes fully passive. And I mean, again, just to use my own personal example of some of these completely passive, under the bed sleep sensors. I've had one under my mattress for 3 years. I forget that it's there until I have bad sleep. I'm about to get photobombed by a cat. Excuse me. But I think in the trials, I think we usually see 60 to 70%. I think there's one of the things we need to look at, data missingness, because sometimes you have such a continuous stream that if you miss, 2 days worth of data out of a 30-day continuous stream, is that important? Unlike missing a visit where patients come in once every 30 days. And so I don't know if there really is a kind of a cut point. I think we look at that in the analytics point about, can we still get a signal if we have certain levels of missingness? But I think we shoot for around almost like a 70% compliance adherence rate. But the long-term usability kind of peters out after about 6 months from what I've seen, unless there's other cases where it's purely passive.
Yeah, I think that intuitively, you know, when we're choosing devices, we think a lot about battery life, ease of data transfer, and all those pieces do help to drive our compliance. And I think operationally, there's a ton that can be done from a training perspective, site support, CRO management to really help those numbers. So again, I think it depends if you're in a clinical trial or real world setting, what your goals are. But we've been able to have quite high compliance. I think there's so much enthusiasm for patients in our trials because there's never been a drug for this disease. So we've been fortunate to have compliance we're really pleased with. But I think definitely thinking about those usability aspects, there will be trade-offs to it. A longer battery life probably means that the device doesn't collect as much. So there's always going to be trade-offs, and you have to think about those trade-offs. You know, is the usability more important? Is what you're collecting or the amount that you're collecting more important, and so forth. And so just being mindful of those trade-offs is, I think, really important.
Tom,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Tom.
I was going to say a little bit on the BYOD and the provision devices. I think we're still largely sitting with provision devices for a lot of the early development space. I think we'd love to use BYOD, but I think this goes back into your design elements of like how much you give a person. And, you know, like we designed, you give them a phone, you give them a phone that pairs with another device, you give them something else. And so you give like a study in a box of what that actually looks like. I think we'd like to use and we have done some work with provision devices, but when you start dealing with having to manage multiple iOS streams or multiple iOS versions across Android and iOS platforms and stuff, it becomes really complicated. And I think we're venturing in there and figuring it out, but I don't think adoption is widespread yet. And I'd like to get there, but I think I think we're a little hesitant on some of the security measures.
Fantastic. That was a great answer to a complex question. And I think a lot of those elements that you refer to are sort of teased out really nicely and available for folks in the playbook. Tom, Priyanka, I'm going to thank you in just a moment. Before we break and wrap up our session on time, I just want to do a quick run through sort of upcoming happenings as we continue to work to advance the playbook. So first of all, enrollment for the next tour of duty closes this Friday. So if that's been on your mind, anyone who's dialed in, please make sure that you get your applications in. As I said, that will be closing Friday, and we are very excited to embark on our work to continue to advance all of this work at the community level. The timeline for that work is here. Enrollment closes this Friday, and the sprint will run November through the end of April next year. We are always pushing as hard as we can to deliver clinical quality evidence on a tech timeline, so this will move quickly. There's an opportunity for you to give feedback on the playbook at playbook.dimesociety.org. If you're using this with your teams and you have suggestions for areas we can clarify or things that we can illuminate in a different way, please do let us know. And our masterclass series continues. And next week we have our colleague Steve Steinhubble from Scripps and Sophia Ward from Harvard, who will be coming and talking about specific considerations around the use of these digital clinical measures in care delivery. So with that, Tom, Priyanka, thank you so much for your time today. You were absolutely phenomenal in getting through a lot of content, fielded some really sort of nitty gritty and important questions very well. For folks who didn't have their question answered, we can continue this conversation over on the Dime Slack. And Tom and Priyanka, most importantly, thank you for your leadership in co-creating the playbook. I remain very proud of this resource that we put together. And I hope many folks who dialed in today and many more are able to sort of use this resource to advance their own work. So Tom, Priyanka, thank you again. Thank you everyone who dialed in to participate in the conversation. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the afternoon. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.